The space around Kepler 442b filled with ships as word of Jake's discovery spread through human communication networks faster than anyone had expected. Captain Lisa Hayes watched from the bridge of the New Horizon as cargo haulers and mining vessels dropped out of hyperspace every few minutes. Most of these ships had no weapons and their crews had no military training, but they kept coming anyway. Ben Collins arrived in his old freighter Starlight Express with a convoy of independent traders who had been operating in this sector for decades. These were rough people who made their living in the dangerous spaces between major alien territories, and they were tired of being pushed around by species that thought humans were weak and worthless. Dr. Amy Rodriguez came aboard one of the medical ships that had responded to Lisa's call for help. She brought supplies and equipment that could help treat the Zephyrian genetic damage caused by decades of Vorthak poison. More importantly, she brought data that proved the aliens had been conducting similar operations on other worlds throughout the galaxy. Down on the planet's surface, Jake worked with Kethara and the other Zephyrian elders to coordinate their defense efforts. The quantum field manipulation that had disabled most Vorthak equipment was holding for now, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the aliens adapted their technology or brought in weapons that could not be affected. Jake learned more about Zephyrian history and culture through his mental connection with Kethara. These beings had once been explorers who traveled between the stars using quantum tunneling technology that was thousands of years ahead of anything other species possessed. They had encountered the Vorthak centuries ago and tried to establish peaceful contact. The Vorthak response had been immediate and brutal. They saw the Zephyrians as a threat to their expansion plans and decided to eliminate them before they could share their advanced technology with other species. The poison in the water supply had been just the beginning of a campaign designed to make the Zephyrians extinct, while making it look like natural causes. Jake felt sick as he realized how many Zephyrian worlds had been destroyed over the centuries, while the rest of the galaxy looked the other way. The survivors on Kepler 442b were probably the last members of their entire species, and the Vorthak had been slowly killing them while pretending to protect them from more aggressive alien threats. But now, something had changed. The arrival of human ships had given the Zephyrians hope that not all species were willing to ignore genocide when it was convenient to do so. Kethara told Jake that his people had been watching human behavior for years and had been impressed by their willingness to help others, even when there was no obvious benefit to themselves. The standoff in space intensified as more ships arrived from both sides. Vorthak battlecruisers moved into positions around the planet while human vessels formed a protective screen that had no real hope of stopping a military assault. Jake knew that most of the human captains understood they were outgunned, but they stayed anyway because they believed in something more important than their own safety. Jake received a communication from Lisa Hayes informing him that representatives from several major alien powers had arrived to observe the situation. The Karathi Empire had sent a diplomatic vessel along with offers to mediate the dispute. The machine collective known as the Nexus had dispatched analysis units to study what they called an anomalous development in galactic political patterns. Even more surprising was the arrival of ships from the Void Watchers, an ancient species that rarely involved themselves in the affairs of younger civilizations. Jake had never heard of them taking interest in anything that did not threaten the stability of space itself. Their presence suggested that what was happening on Kepler 442b was being viewed as more significant than a simple territorial dispute. Jake realized that his decision to help the Zephyrians had created ripple effects throughout the galaxy that no one could have predicted. Species that had ignored each other for centuries were suddenly paying attention to events on a minor mining world because humans had demonstrated that sometimes individuals could make choices that changed everything. The Vorthak Consortium was clearly struggling to understand how the situation had escalated so quickly. Their commander demanded that all human ships leave the system immediately and threatened to file complaints with Earth Command about unauthorized military operations. When the humans refused to leave, the Vorthak began making threats about economic sanctions that would hurt human colonies throughout the sector. But Jake could see that the Vorthak were actually afraid. They had built their power on the assumption that weaker species would always submit to stronger ones and that other civilizations would not interfere in disputes that did not affect them directly. The sight of human cargo ships willing to face battlecruisers was challenging everything they believed about how the galaxy worked. Jake worked with the Zephyrians to demonstrate their quantum technology for the human crews and alien observers. They created energy barriers that could stop advanced weapons and showed how they could manipulate matter at the molecular level. Most impressive was their ability to open temporary tunnels through space that could allow instant travel between distant locations. The demonstration had exactly the effect that Jake hoped it would. Every species watching realized that the beings they had dismissed as primitive animals actually possessed technology that could revolutionize space travel and communication. The Zephyrians were not just another weak civilization being bullied by a powerful corporation, but potential partners who could offer incredible advances to anyone who treated them with respect. Jake felt the political situation shifting as alien. Governments began calculating how Zephyrian technology could benefit their own civilizations. The Karathi Empire quietly began offering security guarantees to any species willing to share advanced technology with them. The Nexus started broadcasting analysis indicating that cooperative relationships produced better outcomes than exploitative ones. Even species that had never shown interest in human affairs began sending representatives to observe the standoff. Jake realized that his actions had forced the entire galaxy to confront questions about how advanced civilizations should treat less powerful ones and whether genocide could be ignored when it was economically convenient. The Vorthak found themselves increasingly isolated as their traditional allies began questioning whether supporting them was worth the political costs. The consortium had always maintained that their expansion was bringing civilization and order to primitive worlds, but the evidence of deliberate genocide was becoming impossible to ignore. Jake knew that the real test was still coming. The Vorthak had invested too much in their control of Kepler 442b to simply walk away from a confrontation. They would either have to admit they were wrong about the Zephyrians and face investigation for their crimes, or they would have to escalate the conflict and risk a war that could spread throughout the sector. Cathara contacted Jake through their mental link to share disturbing news. Zephyrian sensors had detected large numbers of Vorthak reinforcements moving toward the system, including weapons platforms that could destroy entire planets. The aliens were preparing for a final solution that would eliminate all witnesses to their crimes. Jake realized that all the political maneuvering and diplomatic pressure might not be enough to save the Zephyrians if the Vorthak decided to commit complete genocide rather than face exposure of their past actions. The human ships in orbit were brave, but they could not stand against the military force that was approaching the system. But Jake also knew that the galaxy was watching, and that whatever happened next would determine whether powerful species could continue to destroy weaker ones with impunity. The choice was no longer just about one human and one alien species, but about what kind of civilization the galaxy wanted to become. Jake stood in the main chamber of the Zephyrian complex watching as Cathara and the other elders prepared for what might be their final act as a species. The approaching Vorthak fleet contained enough firepower to crack the planet's crust and eliminate all evidence that the Zephyrians had ever existed. Jake knew the aliens were desperate enough to commit complete planetary destruction rather than face investigation for their crimes. Captain Lisa Hayes contacted Jake from orbit to report that human ships were still arriving despite the obvious danger. Word had spread to mining colonies and trading posts throughout the sector, and people were coming to witness what everyone understood might be the last stand of two species against overwhelming odds. Lisa's voice was calm, but Jake could hear the tension as she described the size of the Vorthak battle fleet. But something unexpected was happening in the space around Kepler 442b. Ships from dozens of different species were moving into the system not to support the Vorthak but to observe or even quietly assist the human and Zephyrian alliance. Jake learned that the Karathi Empire had positioned war vessels just outside the engagement zone, while the Nexus Collective had deployed analysis platforms that were studying every aspect of the situation. Most surprising of all was the presence of ancient species that had not been seen in this part of the galaxy for centuries. The Void Watchers had sent not just observers, but what appeared to be defensive platforms that could protect planets from complete destruction. Jake realized that his simple act of refusing to abandon the Zephyrians had attracted attention from civilizations that were older and more powerful than the Vorthak. Cathara explained through their mental connection that the Zephyrians had been preparing for this moment for decades. They had hidden not just from the Vorthak, but from the entire galaxy because they needed time to develop defenses that could protect them when they finally revealed their true nature. The quantum technology Jake had witnessed was only a small part of what his allies could accomplish. Jake felt the ground vibrate as ancient machinery deep within the planet began to activate. The Zephyrians had spent generations building a network that connected every crystal formation on their world, and now they were using that network to create something that had never been attempted before. They were going to demonstrate that some things were more important than individual survival. The Vorthak fleet moved into attack formation, and their commander broadcast a final ultimatum. All non-consortium vessels were ordered to leave the system immediately, or be destroyed as pirates and terrorists. The alien voice was confident and threatening, but Jake could detect an edge of uncertainty that had not been there before. The Vorthak had expected to face a few human cargo ships, not representatives from half the galaxy. Jake watched through the chamber's crystal walls as the space battle began. The human ships were hopelessly outmatched, but they did not scatter or flee. Instead, they formed defensive formations around the planet and began broadcasting everything that happened to communication networks throughout known space. If the Zephyrians were going to be destroyed, the entire galaxy would witness the crime. That was when the Zephyrians revealed the true extent of their abilities. The quantum field network that Jake had seen them activate began to project a defensive barrier around the entire planet. The first Vorthak weapons to strike this barrier were not just deflected, but completely absorbed and converted into energy that made the shield stronger. Jake felt Cathara's satisfaction through their mental link as centuries of preparation finally revealed their purpose. The Zephyrians had used the time they gained by pretending to be dying animals to develop technology that could protect not just themselves but any species willing to stand with them against oppression. The barrier around Kepler 442b began to pulse with energy patterns that Jake recognized from his studies of the quantum crystal data. The Zephyrians were not just defending their world, but broadcasting information about their technology to every ship in the system. They were sharing knowledge that could revolutionize space travel and energy production with anyone who proved they could be trusted. Jake realized that this was the moment that would define the future of galactic civilization. The Zephyrians were offering their advanced technology to species that had shown they were willing to protect the weak rather than exploit them. The humans who had risked their lives to defend. Strangers were being rewarded with knowledge that could make their species one of the most advanced in the galaxy. But the offer came with conditions that Jake found both inspiring and terrifying. The quantum technology would only work for species that used it to protect others rather than conquer them. Any civilization that tried to use Zephyrian knowledge for genocide or oppression would find their equipment failing at critical moments. The Vorthak fleet found itself in an impossible situation. Their weapons could not penetrate the planetary shield, and their equipment was beginning to malfunction as quantum fields disrupted their technology. Worse for them, the entire galaxy was watching as they failed to destroy a species they had claimed was primitive and helpless. Jake felt the political landscape shift as alien governments realized what they were witnessing. The Zephyrians were not just another weak civilization, but potential allies who possessed technology that could benefit everyone. More importantly, they had demonstrated that cooperation produced better results than conquest and that some principles were worth defending regardless of the costs. The Karathi Empire was the first major power to officially recognize the Zephyrian sovereignty and offer them protection under galactic law. The Nexus Collective immediately began negotiations for technology sharing agreements that could benefit both machine and organic civilizations. Even species that had been allied with the Vorthak began quietly distancing themselves from what was clearly becoming a losing position. Jake watched as the Vorthak fleet began to withdraw from the system. Their commander broadcast angry threats about economic retaliation and legal challenges, but everyone could see that the consortium's power had been broken. They had gambled everything on the way, assumption that might made right, and had lost when faced with opponents who refused to accept that logic. The space around Kepler 442b filled with celebration, as human crews realized they had not only survived, but won something incredible. Captain Lisa Hayes contacted Jake to report that Earth Command was sending official diplomatic missions to establish relations with the Zephyrians. Dr. Amy Rodriguez announced that her medical team had already begun, working with Zephyrian healers to develop treatments for species throughout the galaxy. But Jake knew the real victory was not about technology or political alliances. It was about the principle that individuals could make choices that changed the fate of entire civilizations. His decision to stand with the Zephyrians had created a cascade of effects that was reshaping how species interacted throughout known space. Cathara shared images through their mental connection showing Zephyrian settlements across the planet emerging from hiding for the first time in centuries. Crystal cities that had been concealed underground were rising to the surface as his people reclaimed their world. But more importantly, they were welcoming representatives from other species who had proven they could be trusted. Jake realized that he would probably never return to his old life as a geological surveyor. The Zephyrians had asked him to serve as their first ambassador to humanity and help establish the new relationships that were forming throughout the galaxy. It was a responsibility that both excited and terrified him. The galaxy had not adopted human rules, but it had embraced human values about protecting the weak and standing up for what was right regardless of personal cost. Species that had ignored oppression for centuries were suddenly demanding investigations into corporate crimes and supporting the rights of weaker civilizations. Jake looked around the crystal chamber that had become the center of a galactic revolution and smiled. He had come to Kepler 442b looking for minerals and had found something far more valuable. He had discovered that sometimes one person's choice to do the right thing could change the entire universe. Jake crouched behind a barrier made of crystalline material that the Zephyrians had grown from the cave floor in just minutes. The alien energy weapons of the Vorthak enforcers struck the barrier and were absorbed harmlessly into its glowing surface. Jake had never seen anything like it, and he was beginning to understand that his new allies possessed abilities that the galaxy had never suspected. The elder Zephyrian, whose name Jake had learned was Cathara, moved beside him with flowing, graceful steps. Through their strange mental connection, Jake could feel the alien's determination mixed with centuries of sadness. The Zephyrians had watched their people die slowly from the Vorthak poison, while pretending to be nothing more than clever animals to avoid attracting attention. Cathara showed Jake how the Zephyrians could manipulate the quantum fields that existed in all matter. They could make walls stronger than steel, or create energy discharges that would disable electronic equipment. Jake realized that if the Zephyrians had wanted to, they could have driven the Vorthak off their world years ago, but they had chosen to hide instead of fight. Jake asked why they had never used their abilities to defend themselves before now. Through their mental link, Cathara explained that the Zephyrians believed violence only led to more violence, and they had hoped the Vorthak would eventually leave them alone. It was only when Jake showed them that some species could be trusted that they decided to stop hiding. The Vorthak attack intensified, and Jake could hear their commander shouting orders in the tunnel outside the cave. More enforcers were arriving along with heavy weapons that could probably break through even Zephyrian defenses. Jake knew they could not stay trapped in the cave forever, but he also knew that going outside meant certain death. That was when Jake heard the most beautiful sound of his life. Human voices were calling his name from somewhere up in the tunnel system. Captain Lisa Hayes and her crew from the transport ship New Horizon had somehow found their way into the abandoned mining complex and were fighting their way toward the cave. Jake told Cathara that help was coming, and the elder Zephyrian seemed surprised that members of Jake's species would risk their lives for people they had never met. Jake tried to explain that humans sometimes did stupid, brave things when they thought it was important, but he was not sure the concept translated well through their mental connection. Lisa Hayes appeared at the cave entrance, with her weapon drawn and 3 of her crew members behind her. She took one look at the glowing cave and the crystal beings, and Jake crouched behind his barrier and said that this was definitely the weirdest rescue mission she had ever attempted. Jake had never been so happy to see another human in his entire life. Lisa explained that Jake's message had reached dozens of human ships and colonies throughout the sector. Many people were demanding that their governments do something to help the Zephyrians, but bureaucrats moved slowly, and Jake did not have time to wait for official assistance. Lisa had decided to take matters into her own hands. Jake introduced Lisa and her crew to Cathara and watched their expressions change from confusion to wonder as they realized they were meeting members of a highly advanced civilization. The Zephyrians had been hiding their true nature for so long that most of the galaxy had forgotten they were anything more than animals with unusual appearance. Cathara shared some of his memories with Lisa. Through the mental link that Jake facilitated, Lisa saw images of Zephyrian cities that had existed thousands of years ago, with spires of living crystal reaching toward the sky. She saw the arrival of the Vorthak and the slow campaign of poisoning and intimidation that had driven the survivors into hiding in caves and abandoned places. Lisa was amazed by the quantum technology that the Zephyrians possessed, but she was also angry about the genocide that had been committed against them. She told Jake that they needed to get this information to other humans and show the galaxy what the Vorthak Consortium was really doing on worlds they claimed to be developing peacefully. But first they had to survive the next few hours. The Vorthak forces outside the cave were preparing for a final assault with weapons that could probably destroy the entire mountain. Jake and Lisa worked together to convince Cathara that hiding was no longer an option and that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to fight for it. The Zephyrians made a decision that their species had avoided for decades. They would use their advanced technology not just to defend themselves, but to send a message to the galaxy that they were not helpless victims. Cathara led his people in a ritual that Jake did not fully understand, but which seemed to awaken systems that had been dormant for generations. The cave filled with light as the Zephyrians activated defenses that had been built into the mountain itself long ago. Jake felt the ground vibrate under his feet as ancient machinery came to life deep in the planet's crust. Through the mental link he shared with Cathara, Jake could sense a network of energy that connected every Zephyrian settlement across the planet outside the cave. The Vorthak weapons fell silent as their equipment began to malfunction. The quantum field manipulation that the Zephyrians were using interfered with most forms of advanced technology, making the alien weapons useless. Jake heard the Vorthak commander screaming orders that his troops could not follow because their communication systems had stopped working. Lisa contacted her ship and learned that similar effects were happening all over the planet. Vorthak installations were going offline one by one as the Zephyrians emerged from hiding and began to reclaim their world. The alien corporation that had controlled Kepler 442b for decades suddenly found itself facing opponents who possessed technology they did not understand. But Jake knew the Vorthak would not give up easily. They had too much invested in this planet to walk away from a fight, and they had reinforcements that could be called in from other systems. The quantum field effects would not work against every type of weapon, and eventually, the aliens would find ways to adapt their technology. Jake realized that the real battle was not going to be fought on Kepler 442b, but in the communication networks and government offices where public opinion was shaped. If humans and other species could see what was really happening here, they might demand changes in how powerful corporations treated weaker civilizations. Lisa had the same thought, and she was already working on a plan. Her ship had recorded everything that had happened in the cave, including clear images of Zephyrian technology and Jake's explanation of the genocide. She wanted to broadcast this information to every human colony and alien world that would listen. Jake looked around the cave at the Zephyrians who were working together to maintain their planetary defense network. These beings had chosen to trust him even though every previous contact with other species had brought them nothing but suffering. Now they were fighting for their survival because one human had refused to abandon them when it would have been easier and safer to walk away. Cathara approached Jake and Lisa with an expression that somehow managed to convey both hope and determination despite his alien features. Through their mental connection, Jake understood that the Zephyrians had made a decision that would change their civilization forever. They were ready to reveal themselves to the galaxy and share their knowledge with species that proved they could be trusted. But first they had to make sure there would be a galaxy worth sharing with. The Vorthak Consortium was not just a threat to one species on one planet, but to the principle that weaker civilizations had the right to exist. If they could be stopped here, then maybe other species would find the courage to stand up to their own oppressors. Captain Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the transport ship New Horizon, watching the stars streak past at faster than light speed. Her crew was running supplies to 3 different human colonies in this sector, and the work was routine and boring. Lisa preferred boring because exciting usually meant someone was shooting at her ship or trying to board it for inspection. The New Horizon was not a warship, but it was fast and had good shields. Lisa had been running cargo between human settlements for 15 years, and had learned to avoid trouble whenever possible. The galaxy was full of alien species who thought humans were weak and stupid, and she was happy to let them keep. Thinking that as long as they left her alone, the communication officer turned around in his chair and held up a data pad with a confused expression on his face. He said they were receiving an encrypted message from someone on Kepler 442b, but the signal was weak and breaking up badly. Lisa frowned because Kepler 442b was controlled by the Vorthak Consortium, and humans there were not supposed to have access to long-range communications. Lisa told her communications officer to clean up the signal and play it on the main screen. The image that appeared showed a young man with dark hair and dirt on his face standing in what looked like a cave filled with strange blue light. Behind him, Lisa could see shapes moving that did not look quite human or quite alien. The man identified himself as Jake Martinez and said he was a geological surveyor working for the Vorthak mining operation. He said he had discovered something important and dangerous and needed help from any human ship that might receive his message. Jake explained that he had found the largest deposit of quantum crystals in known space, but that was not the most important thing he had learned. Jake turned the camera to show the cave around him, and Lisa saw something that made her sit forward in her chair. The moving shapes behind Jake were clearly intelligent beings with bodies that looked like they were made of living crystal. They moved with purpose and seemed to be working on some kind of complex machinery that glowed with its own light. Jake explained that these beings called themselves Zephyrians and that they were not the primitive animals the Vorthak claimed they were. They possessed technology that was thousands of years ahead of anything humans or most other species had developed. They could manipulate energy and matter in ways that seemed like magic but were actually based on scientific principles that humans were only beginning to understand. The Zephyrians were dying because the Vorthak had been slowly poisoning their water supply for decades. The consortium wanted them extinct so they could claim the entire planet without having to deal with the original inhabitants. Jake said he had tried to help the Zephyrians fight back against the poison, but the Vorthak enforcers had come for him. Jake's voice became urgent as he explained that the Zephyrians had shared some of their knowledge with him, including information about quantum field manipulation that could revolutionize space travel. They had also shown him proof that the Vorthak Consortium had been conducting similar genocide operations on dozens of other worlds throughout the galaxy. The message was interrupted by the sound of weapons fire, and Jake's image shook as the cave around him trembled. Jake said the Vorthak had brought in military units to deal with what they were calling a rebellion. He said he did not know how long the Zephyrian defenses would hold against advanced weapons, but he was not going to abandon his new allies. Jake looked directly into the camera and said he was sending all the data he had collected about the quantum crystals and the Zephyrian technology. He said any human who received this information should share it with others because the knowledge belonged to all of humanity, not just the corporations that would try to profit from it. The message ended with Jake saying goodbye and hoping that someone would remember that humans and Zephyrians had stood together against impossible odds. The screen went black and Lisa found herself staring at her own reflection while her mind raced with the implications of what she had just seen. Lisa's first officer was a practical man named Carl Brennan who had served with her for 8 years. He pointed out that getting involved in Vorthak business was a good way to lose their shipping license and possibly their lives. The consortium had enough political power to make human colonies suffer if they decided to punish humanity for interfering. But Lisa could not stop thinking about Jake's message and the images of the Zephyrians working desperately to defend themselves. She had seen too many examples of powerful species crushing weaker ones, while the rest of the galaxy looked the other way. She had always told herself that there was nothing one small cargo ship could do to change the way things worked. Lisa called up the navigation charts and calculated how long it would take to reach Kepler 442b. They could be there in 18 hours if they pushed their engines hard and took some risks with their jump calculations. It would mean abandoning their current mission and possibly walking into a war zone where they had no business being. The crew gathered in the main cargo bay to discuss what they should do. Lisa shared Jake's message with all of them and watched their faces as they saw the Zephyrians and heard about the genocide the Vorthak were committing. Some of her people argued that they should report the information to Earth Command, and let the government decide how to respond. Others said that by the time bureaucrats finished arguing about jurisdiction and diplomatic consequences, Jake and the Zephyrians would all be dead. Lisa's engineer Amy Rodriguez pointed out that the quantum technology Jake had described could give humanity a huge advantage in space travel and trade. If they could save Jake and get him to safety, they might be able to change the balance of power in this entire sector. Lisa made the decision that would define the rest of her life and possibly the future of human civilization. She told her crew that they were going to Kepler 442b, and they were going to help Jake and the Zephyrians whether the Vorthak liked it or not. She said that sometimes you had to choose between what was safe and what was right, and she was tired of always choosing safety. The New Horizon changed course and jumped to maximum speed, heading for a confrontation that none of them were prepared for. As they traveled through hyperspace, Lisa sent encrypted messages to every human ship captain and colony administrator she knew. She shared Jake's data and his message and asked them to spread the information as widely as possible. Lisa did not know if anyone would listen or if her actions would make any difference, but she knew that Jake had made a choice to stand with beings who were different from himself because it was the right thing to do. If a geological surveyor could find that kind of courage, then a cargo ship captain could find it too. The hours passed slowly as the New Horizon raced toward Kepler 442b and an uncertain fate. Lisa spent the time studying the technical data Jake had sent and trying to understand the implications of Zephyrian quantum technology. What she learned convinced her that this was bigger than one human and one alien species. This could change everything if they could survive long enough to share what they had discovered. When they dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler 442b, Lisa was not surprised to see Vorthak warships in orbit around the planet. What did surprise her was the number of other ships that were also approaching the system. It seemed that Jake's message had reached more people than she had dared to hope, and some of them had decided to come see what was happening for themselves. Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stared at the scanner readings on his handheld device. The numbers were impossible, but they were real. Deep beneath the rocky surface of Kepler 442b lay the largest deposit of quantum crystals anyone had ever found. These crystals could power starships for decades and make faster than light travel cheaper than anyone dreamed possible. Jake knew this discovery would change everything, but he also knew it would probably get him killed. The red sun of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the mining colony as Jake walked back toward the main settlement. His boots crunched on the loose gravel that covered most of this barren world. Around him, the landscape stretched endlessly with nothing but rocks and dust as far as anyone could see. This planet was not pretty, but it was rich in minerals that the galaxy needed badly. The Vorthak Consortium owned everything on this world, including the air that Jake breathed. The alien corporation treated humans like tools that could be thrown away when they broke. Jake had seen too many good people disappear when they asked questions or found something the Vorthak wanted to keep secret. He knew his discovery would make the aliens very interested in keeping him quiet forever. As Jake approached the settlement, he noticed something was wrong. There were too many Vorthak enforcers walking around the main buildings. Their tall gray bodies moved with the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. Their black eyes scanned everything and everyone looking for threats. Jake felt his heart race as he realized they were probably looking for him. He changed direction and headed toward the old mining tunnels that ran deep into the mountains. These tunnels had been abandoned years ago when the Vorthak decided they were not profitable enough to maintain. Most humans stayed away from them because strange things lived in the darkness down there. The Vorthak called them Zephyrians and claimed they were just animals that had learned to use simple tools. Jake had seen the Zephyrians a few times during his surveys. They looked like walking crystals that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. They were about as tall as humans, but much thinner with long arms that ended in delicate fingers. The Vorthak said they were dying out from some kind of disease and would be extinct soon. Jake had always wondered if that was really true, or if the Vorthak were just tired of sharing the planet with them. The entrance to the old tunnels was hidden behind a pile of rocks that Jake had to climb over carefully. His boots slipped on the loose stones, but he managed to reach the dark opening without falling. Behind him, he could hear the sound of Vorthak vehicles getting closer to his position. He had maybe 10 minutes before they found his trail and came looking for him. Jake pulled out his flashlight and stepped into the tunnel. The air was cooler here and smelled like metal and something else he could not identify. The walls were smooth and seemed to glow faintly with their own light. As he walked deeper into the mountain, he began to see strange symbols carved into the rock. They were beautiful and complex, like nothing any animal could make. The tunnel opened into a huge cave that took Jake's breath away. The walls were covered in crystals that pulsed with soft blue light. In the center of the cave stood dozens of Zephyrians arranged in a circle around something that looked like a fountain made of living light. They turned to look at Jake as he entered, and he expected them to run away like frightened animals. Instead, they began to speak to each other in voices that sounded like wind chimes mixed with whispers. Jake could not understand their language, but their tone seemed curious rather than afraid. One of them stepped forward, and Jake saw that this one was older than the others. Its crystal body was darker and more complex, with patterns that seemed to shift and change as Jake watched. The elder Zephyrian made a gesture that clearly meant Jake should come closer. Against his better judgment, Jake stepped forward and found himself standing in the circle with these strange beings. The fountain in the center was not made of water, but of energy that flowed and danced like liquid light. Jake realized he was looking at technology that was far beyond anything humans or even the Vorthak possessed. Suddenly, the cave filled with the sound of heavy boots and harsh alien voices. The Vorthak enforcers had found the tunnel entrance and were coming fast. Jake turned to run, but the elder Zephyrian grabbed his arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. It looked directly into Jake's eyes, and Jake felt something impossible happen. For just a moment, he could understand what the creature was thinking. The Zephyrians were not animals, and they were not dying from disease. They were being slowly poisoned by something the Vorthak had put in the water supply years ago. They had retreated to these caves to try to survive, but they knew they were fighting a losing battle. They had given up hope until Jake arrived, and they sensed something different about him. Here was a member of another species who might actually care about their fate. The Vorthak enforcers burst into the cave with weapons drawn and voices raised in anger. Their leader was a massive creature with scars across its gray face and cold black eyes that promised violence. It spoke in the common galactic language that all species used for business and threats. The enforcer demanded that Jake come with them immediately and warned the Zephyrians not to interfere with consortium business. It said that Jake had stolen valuable information that belonged to the Vorthak and would face punishment for his crimes. The aliens raised their weapons and prepared to take Jake by force if necessary. Jake looked around the cave at the Zephyrians who had welcomed him into their sacred space. He thought about all the humans who had disappeared over the years when they became inconvenient for the consortium. He thought about the beautiful crystal beings who were being slowly murdered by corporate greed. Something inside Jake's chest grew hot and angry, and he made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. Jake stepped in front of the elder Zephyrian and told the Vorthak enforcers that they would have to go through him first. He said he knew about the poison in the water and the illegal mining operations and the murder of innocent people. He said he was not going anywhere with them, and neither were his new friends. The Vorthak leader laughed and said that one human could not stop the consortium from taking what it wanted. But as the enforcers moved forward, the Zephyrians began to glow brighter, and the fountain of energy in the center of the cave started to pulse faster. The elder placed its hand on Jake's shoulder, and suddenly the cave filled with light that made the Vorthak weapons useless, and their confidence disappear.